Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. First of all, subhanAllah, when I walked in here, I just, looking around, got extremely excited over the opportunity to have discussions with you all about how we really move all of these concepts and also streamline the various talents and methodologies, whether they're research-based or activism-based, into a more cohesive strategy as a Muslim community. So I want to thank Bayan Claremont and for the opportunity. It's a great honor to be here, alhamdulillah. I also realized, when you're thinking about a long class, you're thinking about how am I going to teach for that entire amount of time? What am I going to prepare? And I realized as I was looking at the time, I was like, okay, actually I'm kind of freaking out right now because the things that I was jotting down and the things I want to talk about in regards to this, I'm actually worried about not getting them all in. So I have a PowerPoint that I don't intend to spend much time on at all. I've got a few papers. The PowerPoint's actually based on one of those papers that was sent to you, Internalized Islamophobia, exploring the faith and identity crisis of American Muslim youth. Sister Dadi Mugahid is on our board of advisors at Yaqeen Institute and is someone that actually helped me with this paper. And, she and I have worked together on a few of these things where we talk about how what's happening with Islam in the public square, more outward looking, how that's affecting Muslims inwardly. And so I benefited a lot from her research in preparing this paper and doing these studies, because what I really wanted to look at was how does Islamophobia impact our own constructions, especially as Muslim youth, and then how do you throw in all those complex identities? We have the most diverse community, ethnically diverse faith community of any faith community in America. The largest demographic, as she mentioned, rightfully so, is the African American community. And then you've got a 50% which is just mixed up with all sorts of things. And so a lot of times when you speak about Muslim American, you're not doing justice to all the complexities of all the identities that are there within Muslim American, that are inside that, or contained within that identity. So what I did was I just had in-depth interviews talking to 30 different Muslim American youth. It's not a very large sample size because what I wanted to focus on more was getting as much depth from the interview as possible. So I wanted to take 30 Muslim youth as opposed to surveying 300 or 400, at a very shallow level. We do have a few studies that we're doing. We have the first study, which was the Doubt Survey, our modern pathways to doubt in Islam, which we released. It was actually the first paper that we released at Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. We're only a year old as a think tank. We have the second study that's going to be released either next week or the week after, inshallah, which is more in depth than the first study. So my job, what I wanted to do was to actually just sit with 30 different young Muslims and talk to them and understand how they're feeling. So a lot of this is preaching to the choir. You guys have heard much of this. I'm sure I'm going to touch on some of the things that Dadi already touched on. But then I'm going to move on to teaching style and how to speak to the community. This being in the background, because once you know your people, then you can speak to your people more effectively. So what are they going through? How are we speaking to their trauma? We're a traumatized community right now. We're a traumatized community right now. And so we need to overwhelm our community with compassion. So sometimes we focus on saying certain things, and then we also, in that vulnerability, as imams, don't speak honestly, or as chaplains or pastors, we're not speaking to issues that our Muslim community needs to hear about. They need to have addressed by us, but we're too afraid to get caught up in some sort of firestorm. So we're not helping them navigate difficult issues because we don't want to touch difficult issues, and you just have a traumatized community, right? A community that is in pain, a community that is vulnerable, and then you mix in all those complexities, okay? Being young, black, and Muslim, that's compounded vulnerability, right? You have to worry about much more. You have to worry about what the average young African American has to worry about in this country, and then you also have to worry about all the peculiarities that come with being Muslim. Being brown and Muslim has its own set of things. Being white and Muslim has its own, what Dr. Jackson calls cultural apostasy, right? It has its own layer as well to it. Being Latino and Muslim right now has its own complexity. So you got to go through all of those identities. But all of that is just merely added trauma. It's difficult to be an other already in America. Add on to that being Muslim when it's not just any other. This is the most feared other of them all. And you tack that onto the identity, and it overwhelms all forms of identity. So that's just to introduce that paper. I recommend you actually read through it. I'm just going to touch it, inshallah. Then I'm going to go to the teaching style of the Prophet ﷺ. Teaching style of the Prophet ﷺ, I'm not going to be cliche here. I mean, some of these things, sensitivity and relevancy, are things that you all know very well, but I want to actually root it in the seerah as much as possible. And then I'll go on to some more, we'll actually watch some videos, inshallah ta'ala, and look at some things, and then look at what's being done right. I won't put anything that's being done wrong, because I don't want to put any imams on blast or put any Islamic speakers on blast as to why this is wrong. But you should already know that the style of yelling doesn't work very well if you just scream at the community and talk, what's associated with the imam or with the Islamic speaker. Tone deaf, loud, angry. These are images that are perpetuated in the media, but they're also perpetuated from the members too. All right, so we're not doing anything to get away from that. If anything, when you walk into a masjid, you're going to have reinforced ideas about Islam that have been planted in your head through different ways. And it's not there's a compassionate yelling too. Malcolm used to compassionately yell, all right? He screamed at us in a way that we needed to be screamed at, but it was compassionate. It was in sync with where the community was at. So you can scream at or you can scream with. So we're getting screamed at all the time within Islamic spaces. So we have to talk about that, inshallah. So this was a paper that I presented in France. So it was at the 4th International Islamophobia Conference, Contending Epistemologies, Eurocentrism, Knowledge Production, and Islamophobia. All right, so I need to move this over a little bit. I know that it's a little shaky. But why and who? So with the rise of Islamophobia, Islam has been cast as irrational, incompatible with modern civilization, inherently violent. This has put Western Muslims in a defensive position in which they constantly have to justify their convictions and fight off the doubts and insecurities that arise in such a climate. I recently wrote a paper for the Huffington Post. I wrote 2 papers in which I was saying the same thing, but in different ways and within different contexts. One of them was Muslims and the left. Can social conservatives be at the forefront of social justice? So that was an article I wrote for the Huffington Post, I believe a year ago, or a little less than a year ago, and then one for CNN, I Am Not Your American Muslim, playing off of Baldwin, obviously. And so the idea that our identities are up for negotiation, and that when we are afraid, when you're a vulnerable community, you will uncritically rush to the embrace of anyone that's willing to embrace you. And whatever you have to leave off the table to be welcome to that table, you're just happy to be at a table, okay? But that's not going to work for very long, and it's a failed strategy. It's like temporary survival, but at some point there has to be a confidence level where we can have our own positions as a community, and we often don't have single positions, but we can at least have our own unique contributions as a Muslim community at the table. And a lot of times in this culture of insecurity, again, it's just who's willing to embrace me, I will take that embrace. I don't care what political positions you want me to have. I don't care what social positions I'm allowed to have. I don't care how you want me to dress. Just tell me where to be, how to be there. Let me be on your stage. Let me be at your table, and I'll be there. And our Muslim youth have sort of soaked that all in, okay? And so we'll have some honest discussion there, and I do want to have a lot of Q&A here, because I'd like to actually talk about our language, not just internally as a Muslim community, but our language to the outside that is influenced by this deep insecurity and vulnerability on the inside, and how that comes off as so disingenuous, okay? Okay, so basically what I did was I did in-depth interviews with 30 young American Muslims, 19 girls, 11 boys. For this research, 15 of the young ladies reported wearing hijabs regularly. And I'll explain why that was a factor here. All of them were born citizens. 24 were children of immigrants, most of whom were eventually naturalized. The ages of the interviewees ranged from 16 to 20, all of them US based. And then we also took into consideration Islamic schools, private schools, and those types of things. So the main point is in identity formation, how do you tie? Oh, we're still not on the TV. We lost it again.
And then it was moved again. So
how about, you know what, can we just send the slides to them?
yeah, we'll do that.
I'll just pull it up on my computer then.
There you go.
And I'll just cover the main points of it. Because again, I don't actually want to spend too much time on this because they could read the paper, inshallah. Did they already read the paper?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good.
They
So
read the paper, both of them this week.
great. So from an identity formation perspective, the idea was to tie in national and religious identity, how the relationship between religious identity, religious discrimination, public national engagement, private national engagement, perceived Islamophobia, and then how you would identify yourself in context of all of that. And we focused on internalized racism. We went over the Black Doll study in 1947 and used similar measures to look at how Muslim children view themselves. And one of the things that we realized, obviously, very quickly is how racialized the Muslim identity is. And that's something that we know that Muslim, and Sister Dadia was talking about this, but Muslim means brown. Muslim means other. Some of you saw the Toyota commercial, which overall was a good commercial, the Super Bowl commercial with the imam jumping in a car with the pastor or the priest and then the rabbi. But still, who is the imam? The imam is still, at the end of the day, he's brown and he's got an accent to some extent, okay? That is the portrayal of Muslims as a whole, and it's part of the otherizing of Muslims, and we also have internalized that to a great extent. So you might have, so when you talk about the racialized Muslim identity, in the process of that otherizing, if a white or black Muslim wears hijab in public, they are immediately deemed foreign. They're looked at as being otherized in some capacity. For the most part, that's a generalization, but that was what we looked at there. And also the impact of low-level harassment. Most of the time, low-level harassment doesn't get reported. It's not factored into these studies, but it's significant. If you've been yelled at in a parking lot, or if you had a waiter that intimidated you, or you had some encounter like that, that has the potential to shape the rest of your life, your psychology for the rest of your life. But that's not going to get reported by CARE or get reported by an MPAC or whatever it may be. That's something that will be buried deep in the psyche of that Muslim, but it's never going to be factored into our research, unfortunately. Also, what types of notions are being internalized? And I think this was probably the most important one for me, the aha moment, if you will, is that the portrayal of Muslims in the media, there are two predominant themes: violence and oppression of women. Okay, those are the two most frequently associated stereotypes with Muslims, that we're violent and that, oh, this is working, okay, good. That we're violent and that we're also, that we have oppression towards women. And if you look at the types of themes that are put out there, more Americans are likely to believe that Islam oppresses women than they are to believe that Islam is violent. And more young Muslims are likely to internalize the idea that Islam oppresses women than the idea that Islam is violent. And that's not insignificant, because when you see Muslim organizations out there, we're constantly distancing ourselves from what? From violence. So our focus as communities, obviously because we've bought into the framing of national security, so the way we counter the idea that we're terrorists is that we're good eyes on terrorists and we're needed for the war on terror, which is a deeply problematic and bigoted construction. But hey, we have to constantly push back on this idea that we're not violent, we're not terrorists. But the young Muslim doesn't believe necessarily that Islam is violent. Most young Muslims see right through that. But they do believe that Islam is repressive towards women. And that's not by accident, right? That is constantly messaged through the different types of media that our young people are consuming. And our communities are doing a horrible job of actually combating that stereotype, because Islam does not oppress women, but Islamic spaces, I think, even in the United States, are repressive towards women, and that reinforces how young Muslim women in particular feel about their religion. So a lot of times there's that reinforcement via personal experience. Psychologically, you tend to view God, or you tend to deal with God in the way that you deal with authority in your life. So if you had abusive authority in life, you might view God in that same light. There's a connection between God and authority in your life. And when I say authority, I'm not talking about governmental authority or security. I'm talking about parents. I'm talking about your uncle, your aunt, those that were authority figures in your life. You tend to view God in that same spectrum. And so if you have abusive parents, that reinforces the notion that God is abusive and angry, and that Islam is restrictive, okay? In restrictive cultures, we immediately associate the backwardness of culture, quote unquote Muslim cultures, okay, with Islam itself, when they have absolutely nothing to do with Islam. Insufficient community spaces. Only 3 of the 30 youth that I actually interviewed felt like the Masjid was welcoming. I know that's no surprise to people, but the thing is that these were 30 youth that had an association, some sort of association with the Masjid already, meaning either their parents were regulars at the Masjid, or they were regulars at the Masjid, or they were easy for me to find. I didn't have to look for these 30 youth. All right, so they were connected. They were part of the connected layer of the Muslim community for the most part, and only 3 of them could actually say that they felt like the Masjid was welcoming. And this was, it's painful, but all 3 of those youth referenced support, and they referenced their comfort in bringing non-Muslim friends with them to their worship services. Most of them would not want to bring their friends, actually expressed awkwardness when I asked them, how would you feel if your friend expressed interest in Islam? Would you bring them to your masjid? Or would you feel like you have to put in a bunch of protocols in place to be able to accommodate, to not have a super awkward experience for this non-Muslim friend of yours? And most of them are embarrassed to bring their non-Muslim friends to the masjid when they ask about Islam. When we looked at the pathways to doubt, so historical events, references to certain historical events and battles in the early history of Islam figure into these associations, and simple reassurances that Islam means peace do little to curb the resultant doubts. You could have easily said, there was this notion, at least in the 1960s, 1970s, when we study Islam, particularly how Islam became such an attractive liberation theology, and how Islamic references found their ways into Edward Blyden and Garveyite, rhetoric, was the idea that Islam is a slave-breaking religion, Christianity is a slave-making religion. That's how it used to be described, right? But how do you do that now when you have images of ISIS enslaving Yazidi girls, throwing people off of roofs, and you have all of these horrible images being perpetuated through the media? Libya, right? This recent horrific exposure of slavery in Libya. You can't push that anymore without having some significant intellectual and social challenges. Not that we would push that simple line that Islam is a slave-breaking religion, Christianity is a slave-making religion, but simply that now you have a lot of young people that are asking questions like, wait a minute, I've been taught my entire life that Islam did away with slavery, but I'm hearing, Islamophobia has become much more sophisticated now. You got Sean Hannity quoting Sirah. All right, you think about that, and that was why we formed, at least Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research, a think tank that actually deals with the challenges to the religion itself rather than the demographical challenges, which ISPU does a great job of dealing with, is because when Rudy Giuliani goes on Fox News and shouts out literally that, well, Muhammad killed 1,000 Jews, no one's going to respond to the substance of his argument. People will say Islamophobia, people will say it's discriminatory, it's abusive rhetoric, it's wrong, but you can't expect Snopes.com or Medialite to actually sit there and give a detailed portrayal of Banu Qurayza and what actually happened between the Prophet ﷺ and those 3 tribes, okay? So the point being is that you can't have simple reassurances anymore and just tell people, no, Islam means peace, Islam is this, Islam is that. You have to actually respond to, and we're frankly not equipped many times to respond to some of these arguments that are becoming mainstream now, that used to be on the fringes and used to be on these, Answering Islam and those types of websites, but are now in the mainstream, you have to be able to have at least an intelligent discussion about them and have some sort of competent answer on these issues, okay? And you can't just, pamphlets don't work anymore. You know, we used to pass out pamphlets on Islam. Like I remember we used to do the 500 pamphlets a week and those simple little pamphlets, you know, 2-3 pages, they weren't colored, they were black and white. And that was our da'wah, that was the extent of it just doesn't work like that anymore because the psyche has changed. The way that people think about Islam, even those that are motivated to defend the Muslim community because they feel like we're being mistreated and discriminated against, still have serious aversion to Islam in many cases. And that's something that's coming through the polling industry. And actually, you know, when we did at Yaqeen Institute, we studied, you know, the effects of Islamophobia, and we actually looked at our target audiences and craft our messaging in accordance with that. We found that the closest demographic to the Muslim middle was actually non-Muslim allies. Because the Muslim middle wants to feel good about its faith, but feels like it can't feel good about its faith because it's not finding solid information on Islam. They don't want to be on ex-Muslim forums on Reddit. They don't want to do that. They want to find something that reassures them in their Islam, but they're not finding it. Non-Muslim allies go back to their families and their circles, and their circles question them and you know, question their advocacy. Well, how are you advocating on behalf of the Muslim community? Don't you know that they're pushing Sharia law? Don't you know that they believe this? Don't you? And then they come back to their Muslim friends and say, hey, where can we find information on Islam? Because this is, I'm getting asked these questions from my people in their safe spaces, okay? So we found those two demographics actually be closest together when we did our surveying of the effects of Islamophobia. So the point being is that simple reassurances don't work anymore. You have to be able to engage in an intelligent conversation, have a competent response, a confident, competent response on these issues that we wouldn't have had to answer for in the past. One of the problems that we also had is that, you know, we tell people that, you know, that therapy, I think there's still a lot of stigmatizing, obviously in the general public and probably more so within the Muslim community, about going to a therapist and getting counseling and depression as a condition, not just something where you read in ma'al usri yusra and it all just goes away suddenly like it's actually a thing. But what's the problem is that when you send young Muslims or you send adult Muslims, a Muslim couple, to a marriage therapist that has ingested all of this garbage herself or himself, that's going to come out in the counseling. And that was one of the most alarming things, is that the therapeutic alliance has been compromised, because when I talked to these young Muslims, 9 of them who'd actually been to therapy, they all mentioned that they felt judged by their therapist. The therapist was ready to say that your family must be oppressing you and who forced the hijab. They were immediately ready to run to those conclusions because the therapists have also ingested those types of things. And then we might say to ourselves, well, you know, we just have to have more Muslim therapists, simple as that. But because of the importance of keeping, you know, how people want to keep their lives private, they don't want others to know about their therapy. Even in the presence of Muslim therapists, most Muslims are still going to end up going to non-Muslim therapists. And so that's something that we just have to be conscious of, that we have to deal with that as well. You know, what's been ingested in the world of therapy. And then lastly, Islam empowerment or impediment. Do I have to give it up to get places? Okay. There's this young sister, some of you may have seen her in Chicago, Tahir al-Rahman, who's the first hijabi news broadcaster in mainstream news. And I have such a great appreciation for her, subhanAllah, because as I was reading through her story, she did not go online for 5 years and talk about how she's going to be the first hijabi to be on the news. She just did hard work for all these years, excelled in her journalism, and was told at least 30, 40 times in her pursuit that your hijab is going to be an obstruction. That if you want to get there, you just need to know it's not my fault. And people that were friendly to her, even within family circles, that look, just give it up, right? And subhanAllah, she stuck through it, and most people did not hear about her until this last week in the community. So that idea that, look, work at it, and you don't have to give it up to get places. Give it up meaning your principles, your identity, whatever that may be, but that is by and large how Muslims feel, that they have to compromise in order to get places, and that they will not be accepted or they will not be able to achieve if they hold on to their Islamic identity and their construction. So insecurity equals idleness. And so the way that obviously, the conclusion of my research, it again seems like common sense, but it's not often pushed out there. Volunteerism and contribution through an Islamic framework. That when you can teach people how to contribute within their Islamic identity, to contribute because of their Islamic identity, and to put them in spaces where they can excel and they can root that within the tradition, then that does not just make them less likely to give up parts of their identity, but it also allows them to embrace their identity fully. I interviewed a young girl, Zainab, 17, who said that she wasn't proud of her hijab until she wore it when she was 14 to serve at a homeless event. And she said, someone came up to me and said, I always see your people around here passing out food. Then she took pride in her identity, right? So you have to push people towards that volunteerism and contribution through an Islamic framework, and then you're going to find that they'll be willing to embrace their identity as a whole. All right, so that's it for the paper. Now I'm just going to move on to any questions, though, on the research, the paper. I'll just open that up for discussion. Then I'll go on to the teaching style of the Prophet ﷺ and then move into that space. Yeah.
Omar, can you go back to that the slide, one of the first diagrams, that one? Can you explain that a little more? Even reading the article is a little bit confusing to see what the implications of this are.
Okay, it would take some time to explain, but religious identity is at the center. The reason being is that if you're in a religious household, and religious is subjective here, but you're in a household that strongly identifies with the tradition, a Muslim American. Let's put it this way, a Pakistani Muslim American from a religious household is more likely to identify with a Palestinian Muslim American from a religious household, or even in some cases an African American Muslim American household, than with people that are from their own nationality or ethnic background that are not as religious. When religious identity is placed at the center in your upbringing, then that's likely to influence all of your identities and your engagements a lot more. So with religious identity, the implications of experienced negative representations in the media going to religious identity, that leads to, in many cases, how that person that wants to maintain the religious identity formulates their national identity. So that sort of becomes the filter, because I cannot formulate my national identity except that if I want to still be religious and formulate and have a national identity, then I have to adopt certain positions. I have to be patriotic with a capital P. I have to express certain loyalties that other people do not have to express over and over and over again in order to have that national identity and still be able to maintain my religion. The effect on religious discrimination, perceived Islamophobia. So those are really the coming into religious identity, right? So experienced negative representations, perceived Islamophobia, experienced religious discrimination. All of that to say that insecurity is what could lead to national identity. Some people move, or they channel that into private national engagement or public national engagement, but still, if your politics is the politics of acceptance and respectability, then that's going to influence how you deal with the public and how you deal with the private. So I'll share with you, when it comes to, for example, police brutality or militarism. Police brutality, James Baldwin said that the threshold for success is how quick you can become white in this country, right? And for the Muslim community, the immigrant mentality at times is how do we quickly rise to a place where we're accepted politically and we're not minorities anymore? How do we assimilate as quickly as possible? So, Dallas is a very interesting place because we have one of the worst track records of police brutality. Dallas is the epitome of poverty. South Dallas is bigger than Atlanta and Seattle combined. South Dallas, and there's an apartheid in Dallas. It's one of the most racially segregated cities that you'll see in America. All right, so South Dallas is black and Latino as well. Okay, and then North Dallas is, how do you keep South Dallas away? Wall it off. All right, so the Dallas Police Department has one of the worst track records on police brutality, but we also have had we had the murder of 5 police officers at the protest last year, July 7th of last year. The way that the Muslim community responds to come forth to pledge money for the fallen officers' families, as opposed to the families that have suffered from police brutality. There's no PR political currency from supporting a family that lost their member or lost a son or whatever it may be to police brutality. You're not going to get anything. But hey, look, Jordan Edwards' dad has to drive trucks to pay for the legal defense right now to prosecute an officer that shot his 15-year-old unarmed dead. All right? Whereas an officer that was shot dead, and obviously it's grievous, and we do grieve with people that are shot dead unjustly, period, will have funds that will generate $300,000, $400,000 of support for the family. This family has to wash cars and go, do work all sorts of odd jobs just to try to get justice, which most likely will not result in justice. Where will the Muslim community go? The Muslim community will lean, by and large, towards support the officer's family because it's good. We want to show that we're part of this city, we're a part of this society, and we need to come together and we need to show that, we're good Americans, good, whatever it may be. All right, good Samaritans. Police brutality, when I do all these fundraisers for these families, there's no PR about it. It's just radioactive silence usually. Alhamdulillah, there's some change, but for the most part, that is the 3 bottom things. We have to play respectability all the time. We have to show ourselves. And that to me was the DNC, the problem with the DNC, the Khizr and Ghazala Khan effect. When you put Khizr and Ghazala Khan on the stage, who suffered an immense tragedy and whose son undoubtedly did something heroic with protecting other people when he was killed, the Gold Star family. But when you make that the threshold for Muslim Americans, you're peddling the same type of bigotry that eventually manifests itself in the right wing. But as a Muslim community, we're like, yes, Muslims on the stage. Now they're going to believe us. Now they're going to appreciate us. Now they're going to value us. No, they're not. Because if you can't live up to that, if you're a Colin Kaepernick supporting Muslim, you don't meet the threshold. So you're not going to be dignified because there's more to you. So I think that insecurity leads to insecure politics. We have, by and large, as a Muslim community, insecure politics, the politics of insecurity and vulnerability. So our national identity is formed by an insecure religious identity. You had something, Shah?
I was going to comment. The thing that you mentioned about police support versus victims, it's one of the things that pains me every time I see it. Contributes to the divide that we have as Muslims, indigenous and Muslims who came here, because we constantly going through that kind of, did you see? They raised $500,000 for this one, but we couldn't get the Masjid built.
Mm-hmm.
Or we raised $500,000 for this one, but there's a needy family. So it just contributes to that divide that we keep trying to bridge.
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
Shukran, Imam, for being here. I've always loved listening to your talks, especially
Jazakallah khair.
when you spoke about the one that sticks out to me when you spoke about the Prophet and those who were black. I didn't know that. And you talked about those specific things where the Muslim community supports officers, which creates that separation even within the Muslim community itself, because then you have people like Imam Jamil Al-Amin,
Right.
who's still behind bars and other
May Allah forgive him.
in other situations that plagues the African American community. So that's one side of it. but another side of it, you said something that really made me think, which is that every identity comes with its own complexities.
Mm-hmm.
And for the first time, I think sometimes we get into the conversation of who struggled most.
Yeah.
I mean, and I mean, as an African American, I've always been like, why is it that the black Muslims is not, you know what I mean? I kind of get into, we should be respected too, but I, speaking for myself, I think I kind of overlooked the fact that, you know, white Muslims, you know, have gone through struggles, and Latino Muslims are going through struggles, and other communities are going through struggles as well. So I think that we have to be careful of not getting into that conversation of who struggled most, but at the same time, recognize that there is some issues within the Muslim community in regards of race, but at the same time, not, you know, being oppressive to one another.
May Allah reward you. And you know, subhanAllah, that I'm optimistic. I think that we're like, there is this. you have to be shook. Unfortunately, facts don't work for communities, like to push people out of their comfort zones and their complacency. I'm optimistic because I do think that one of the things that Trump did in the Trump era, the ushering in of the Trump eras, did to a lot of the immigrant Muslim community is it taught us that respectability politics have been a spectacular failure, that you have not done any favors for yourself as a community by trying to play that game. And so you need to embrace, while there should be strategies that work. By the way, alhamdulillah, you will never see me attacking a Muslim organization or a Muslim figure online. I don't do it. Never do it. The last time I did it, because I remember it and I regret it and I apologize, was 2014. And I didn't attack, but I was voicing an opinion that was being used to attack. And so I tried to make clear I'm not attacking. There's room to publicly disagree on some of these things. But at the same time, I think we're too vulnerable right now. And it's not Islamic for us to undermine each other in the public square. Some people will play different strategies. As long as that strategy is not undermining the other, it's fine. So some people will have more oppositional politics. Some people will not have, will be, not all respectability politics are bad as long as they're from a place of strategy and well thought out, and it's not just, I want to get a photo op so that we can show, hey, Muslims made it here. And that goes back to, Malcolm was the best book I ever read on the civil rights or on the Malcolm Martin conundrum period was James Cone, Dreams and Nightmares. If any of you have not read it, or if you have not read it, you should absolutely read it. Dreams and Nightmares by James Cone. Malcolm was the moral compass. Malcolm challenged America when America claimed progress and said, "No, you're not. You're not making progress. Putting one black woman in an all-white school and claiming that suddenly now we are this champion of integration. You're not making any progress. That doesn't mean anything because the way that we're still living in terms of public education, you haven't done anything for us." So Malcolm spoke that radical oppositional tone, but that pressures, or it actually helps give. It doesn't undermine those that are working the other side. So I think we should work together. We should always, we should appreciate different strategies in the community. So we should not undermine each other. We should not, some people are going to take certain political stances that will stop them from ever being invited to the White House. And that's good for those that are going to be invited to the White House, as long as they're not going to the White House just to be in the White House and get pictured at the White House. And they can speak to the concerns and the frustrations of those that will never get invited. So we can't undermine one another. That's within our political spectrum. We have to appreciate that complexity. And alhamdulillah, as long as you're not undermining the other, you're fine. The problem is that we usually do undermine each other. So those that play different types or those that have different types of strategies typically do undermine the other. Now when it comes to the complexities now of which community struggled more. When I said that we've been shaken up as a Muslim community, I think that for a lot of people, a lot of immigrants in particular, and you've got to keep in mind here that immigrants come here not to get politically involved, not to do da'wah. They come here for economic opportunity. They're not interested in getting caught up in in political debates or circuses. They're here, they came, and that's not Muslim immigrants. That's usually, by and large, the immigrant mentality period is the promise of economic opportunity. So when you get thrust into the political, when you become a political football as a community, you can try to hide and weather the storm, and then you realize that this isn't a tornado, this is a hurricane that's going to be around for a long time. You can't afford to close yourself off. You have to actually educate yourself as to how communities have been dealing with the struggles that they've been dealing with for some time. In New Orleans, you know what got the immigrant community to recognize police brutality is when a wealthy Muslim doctor was killed by the police unjustly. Then suddenly everything changed for the community. Everyone got it. Like, okay, what we've been hearing about all these years, okay, we get it now. Unfortunately, it took that. So usually the intersectionality has to be one of pain. When there's an intersection of pain, then there is an intersection of realization. And then you can start to form coalitions where people can understand one another. The problem is right now, what about the Latino Muslims? What about the Dreamers issue? What about the immigration issue? So if you do the who struggles more thing, I mean, are our communities really understanding the gravity right now of the immigration debate and what implications it has on us as a Muslim community as a whole and what implications it has on society? Now, with the polarization or with some of the rifts that exist more so in some cities between the African American community and the Hispanic community, we have a growing Muslim Hispanic population. And sometimes sitting at that table is really awkward. Because, and I'm speaking from experience here, trying to come to some sort of understanding and unified platform in the African American community, there isn't as much sympathy towards the Dreamers issue as there might be, interestingly enough, in some of the immigrant Muslim communities, because within those immigrant Muslim communities, some people know someone that has their status in limbo right now, and that traumatizes the entire community. If you look a few days ago, wasn't it Cleveland, where they had the pillar of the community that was the front page of CNN, the Palestinian brother? Youngstown, okay, where they were talking about that brother that was getting deported, and it was the front page of CNN for some time. So intersectionality has to start with the intersectionality of pain. Then you can start to have understanding. Then you can start to move things forward. So at the political level, the coalescing of Black Lives Matter and the Free Palestine movement, the BDS movement, has done a lot of good for both causes. For Black Lives Matter to internationalize Black Lives Matter, it's done a lot of good. I'm just talking about the level of political theory, and for the Palestinian issue as well as the Muslim issue. It's funny because the Palestinian cause within the Muslim community, by and large, was the Muslim cause, right? In the 1990s in particular, right? That was a big-time Muslim cause. But now there's just so much going on in the Muslim world that sort of died down in the Muslim community, but within, amongst activists for freedom and liberation, the Palestinian cause is getting more attention now. So it's just, you have to just put it all in one room. You've got to create spaces, which is why I think this space is so wonderful, honestly. This is such a great space because you all are influencers from different demographics and different communities, so you get to express that without all the fanfare or all of the repercussions of manufactured social media outrage over every single sentence that's not said the way that some people would like it to be said. So you get to actually talk about that. So I think these types of spaces are important, inshallah, so that we don't downplay other people's struggles and other people's pain. And what you mentioned about white Muslims, I mean, yeah, again, Dr. Sherman Jackson calls it cultural apostasy. It's a major issue, obviously, and everyone has to have the opportunity to speak of their struggles, their unique struggles as Muslims in this country right now.